She said you can't do that because consumers will be confused. And they will mistake your new handmade bourbon with that horrible, wretched T.W. Samuels whiskey that we made for 150 years. So he agreed and actually put her in charge of creating the name and designing the bottle. And she took that responsibility seriously. So much so that she set up a little office in their home with a drafting table, and her vision was to create a name and design a bottle that would reflect the handmade values of my grandfather's handmade whiskey. Several months later, my grandmother presented my grandfather with the Maker'sMark name and bottle design that's never changed. This bottle looks, that I just grabbed off the bar, looks exactly like the very first bottle. And Maker'sMark is the only whiskey in the world ever named by a female. My grandparents were both longtime passionate collectors of English pewter, and they noticed that the craftsmen that handmade the English pewter on their proudest pieces, as a sign of being made by hand, would always make a mark, the mark of the maker. My grandmother suggested to my grandfather that he was a craftsman, had produced the most handmade whiskey in the world, and she suggested that he make his mark. So the mark of the maker, the maker's mark, is on every single label, and it's also blown into the glass. The S, I think it's on your tasting mat as well, the S is for Samuels. The Roman numeral 4 denotes my grandfather having been a registered 4th generation distiller of whiskey in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. There were 2 additional generations that made whiskey illegally, and she didn't count them. The star is for Star Hill Farm, which is what Robert Samuels named that land grant farm when he first settled in what was then Bourbon County, Virginia. There are 3 breaks in the circle, and each break in the circle represents the 3 instances in the history of America when it's been illegal to produce distilled spirits in America. Civil War, World War I, and Prohibition. So it's the mark of the maker, the maker's mark. What's the proper way to spell the word whiskey? Depends. The Americans and the Irish always spell the word whiskey with an E, E-Y. My grandmother decided to spell the word whiskey the proper way, as the Scotch distillers spell the word whiskey, which is without an E, as a tribute to the family having produced and distilled whiskey in Samuel, Scotland, as far back as the early 1500s. Since the very beginning, every single label on every single bottle has been printed and torn by hand at the distillery. And it was my grandmother who suggested, what better way to finish off the handmade process than to seal each and every bottle by hand in red wax. And that way she suggested that since each bottle would be sealed by hand, that each would be a little different and distinct from the next, which is the mark of a handmade piece. Today, I can promise you that we have by far and away the most inefficient bottling line in our industry. There are companies that will bottle 1,000 bottles a minute so fast it will give you a headache. At Maker'sMark, we have 5 ladies that work on the bottling line, and they rotate jobs every 30 minutes. So at any given time, we'll have 3 or 4 of those ladies hand dipping the bottles, and they can each hand dip about 15 bottles a minute. Now, of those ladies on the bottling line, only one is left-handed. And her name is Lisa. And I can tell you that Lisa hand dipped this bottle. Because the tendril runs longest down the back and bends slightly to the right.